Hello, I'm Roger Citron. I'm an Associate Dean and Professor of Law at Touro University, Jacob D. Fuchsberg Law Center. This is a Touro Law Review podcast, and our guest is Patty Salkin. Patty is a former Dean of the Law School. Currently, she is the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs for Touro University and Provost of the Graduate and Professional Divisions in New York. And she's going to be talking to us tonight about her PhD dissertation and forthcoming book on lawyers leading higher education. And before I take a breath, thank you, Patty, or Provost Salkin, I should say, for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Roger.
We always begin the podcast with a little bit of a bio of our guest, and please tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, as you mentioned, currently I serve as the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Provost of Touro University, and Provost of the Graduate and Professional Divisions in particular for New York. And Touro University is home to 19,000 students, about 36 schools and colleges in 4 states, soon to be 5, and in 4 countries. And so it's an exciting adventure. There's a lot of things going on. We're opening up a new medical school in Montana. Prior to this position, as you noted, I was the Dean of the Law Center. And, you know, the one thing that I can't get out of my blood is being a legal educator and being involved in legal education. And so I still teach my land use course at the law school. And I'm the editor of the American Law of Zoning Treatise and the New York Zoning Law and Practice Treatise, as well as a handful of other annually updated zoning and land use publications. And that really is my passion. So,
yeah. With so many students, so many schools, and for you, so many responsibilities, how did you have time to get a PhD? Which is another way of asking, why did you get a PhD?
So I think being in higher education since about 1990, it's always the intellectual quest for knowledge and learning other things and making discoveries and part of scholarly pursuits. And to be honest, you know, my background and my research is all in land use and zoning and government ethics as well. But in my new role, I really wanted to establish myself as a scholar in higher education and higher education leadership in particular. And so the opportunity to pursue the PhD and to be involved in the country's first PhD in creativity and in the first cohort was something that was special and, quite frankly, too good to pass up.
Yeah. Can you just say a little bit more about how you sort of, you know, presented yourself to the program? That is to say, how you came within, I have to use the civil procedure phrase, the jurisdiction of creativity.
So, you know, I was looking at different PhD and EDT programs, and this one came across my radar screen, and it intrigued me because lawyers are creatives by nature, right? We are problem solvers. We like to put the pieces of puzzles together. We like the gamification, if you will, of trying to win our cases. And you have to be creative. You have to outsmart the other side. You have to be precise in your arguments. You have to do your research. And, you know, so I was always interested in that and always interested, you know, in what the creatives add to society and also from a land use perspective. And this was just a unique interdisciplinary opportunity because no two people in the program were alike. Nobody had the same backgrounds. Nobody had the same interests. And it was not just learning from shared readings and shared courses, but we learned from each other And then we really had the opportunity to focus on our dissertations.
And how and when did you come up with the topic for your dissertation? That is, did you always think it was a pretty straight line from thinking about doing the program to this is what I write about, or was it a little bit more iterative?
No, actually, to get into the program as part of the admissions process, you had to submit sort of your pitch for your dissertation. So I was committed to this more than 3 years ago, in getting there, and I had done a little bit of research, but honestly, what I thought I was going to write about just expanded exponentially once I got into the research.
Yeah, and one of the things, I simplified this a little bit in the introductory remarks. This actually, your dissertation, you're still finishing it. I think we were talking about before we started recording, but it's also going to be a book forthcoming in the fall. And just so we have it, if you will, as part of the podcast, what will the title of your book be?
Yeah, so the dissertation is completed, it's submitted, it's uploaded onto ProQuest. I've graduated from the program, but I've delayed ProQuest releasing it so that the book can come out first. And the book is going to be called May It Please the Campus, Lawyers Leading Higher Education.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing is I had a lot of the data on the dissertation about a year ago, but I've been keeping track of the trends. And so I've been updating the data, updating the charts. And so the dissertation, when it's published and available to the public, will be a year behind actually the new data in the book.
And you shared the dissertation with me, and so I want to turn to that. You've got a lot of data and charts, so good luck keeping that updated. But let me begin with where you start, which is the introductory part in what you sent me is called Higher Education in Crisis. And what are the pieces or the components of the crisis that you describe in the first part in the introduction of your dissertation?
So, it's no surprise in reading the newspaper, and I started this pre-COVID, right, and then COVID hit in the middle of the research. But higher education is really experiencing and reacting to major disruptions that include economic crises. Some of the economic crises came about as a result of the pandemic. Some of the economic crises came about as a result of the shift in demographics. And around the country, in most of the country, there are fewer middle school and high school students in the pipeline going into higher education. And then we experienced the time nationally where I think that there's been a lot of skepticism about the value of higher education and the value proposition, and a lot more young people choosing not to go to undergraduate education, which again causes problems for the schools. Higher education has become a highly regulated business, quite frankly. And so, way back when, you could just open a school, and really part of the dissertation tracks all of the changes from the 1970s and particularly the 1980s in the rise of the regulatory state. And all of a sudden, we've got all these lawyers involved in higher education that really were not involved in the business of higher education before. And so, and some of this also I track, and it's ironic or maybe sad. I looked at the President's Mission Report in the 1960s on campus unrest. And then, if you think back while I'm writing the dissertation, all of the civil unrest issues that we've had in the community and on our campuses, dealing with the death of George Floyd, dealing with racism issues, dealing with slavery issues, and all of the schools that have had to respond because their founders or buildings had names or roots related to slavery. And then prior to that, maybe, in the last 5-10 years, there's been a greater emphasis on First Amendment, free speech rights on campuses. We've had a lot of faculty union issues and staff union issues on campuses. And so, all of these legal issues really that surround the campus, I think demand a different mindset.
And yeah, there's a lot in your answer. The first thing I want to make sure, when we talk about higher education, are you including professional schools in your in what you're discussing and what we're talking about tonight?
So I limited my research to the roughly 4,300 currently classified institutions of higher education. So proprietary business schools, for example, would not be included in that list, but community colleges would be, as well as four-year schools. And I included professional schools. However, just because I thought that it would not help in making the case, I did not include the private independent law schools, of which there's still about a little over a dozen. And those deans are by nature the dean and the president, because they're not attached to a university. But that would have been a constant number. Actually, the number of private independent law schools has decreased over the years. But that still would have been a number that I thought would have inflated or skewed the trend a little bit.
And then the other thing, I teach administrative law, and so there was one sort of thing that hooked me, which was we traditionally, at least in administrative law, think about, 1980, Ronald Reagan, at least rhetorically, deregulation, and in fact, in certain areas of the federal government, in fact, deregulatory measures were adopted or taken. And so it was interesting in the overview that you provided that you mentioned that, in fact, at least in the sphere that you analyzed, that was actually a period of increased regulatory activity. Is that, did I hear you correctly? And if so, why or how did that happen?
So, I think it started really in higher education in the 60s and 70s when financial aid was really coming in vogue, and when veterans were coming back from the war, and there was an emphasis on all kinds of programs to get students into school, to get them trained for careers. And so, we saw a lot of regulation around financial aid. Then, as we start to go on, we saw Americans with Disabilities Act. There were labor laws were continuing, the U.S. Department of Education, and the accreditation business around higher education started to grow, and lots of specialized accreditors grew to meet the new programs that were being developed as well.
Yeah, and then this is always, I think, an interesting question when you talk about, say, the last 3 decades or 3 or 4 decades of the 20th century, and of course continue into the present. It's kind of a chicken and egg. That is to say, so to what extent did lawyers create a regulatory context or setting in which, by and large, they would be legal type approaches where you'd really want to have a lawyer? That is to say, how much of it was, lawyers creating an environment that was more conducive to lawyers leading, or how much of it was this skill set that we've been talking about that lawyers possess as being oh no, we make sense given the changes going on to guide, to lead.
So, I don't think that there was any premeditation in terms of the regulations and that they require a lawyer to be the president, because most schools had outside counsel. And another thing that I talk about in the paper, soon to be the book, is sort of the rise of the in-house general counsel at colleges and universities. And, that didn't really happen until the 1960s. And then in the last decade, it has exploded. And, most universities, when you look at the membership of the National Association of College and University Attorneys, it has exploded to 5,000 or 6,000 members. And so, they may be law firms that provide services, but a lot of in-house counsel. And honestly, that's another group that I track in the research, because there has been an increase in the number of people who have served as general counsel to colleges and universities, who have then become presidents either of their school or of another school, and arguably because they're familiar with the business issues and the regulatory issues of running an institution of higher education, because generally the general counsel is a trusted advisor to the president.
Yeah, yeah.
And today on college campuses, a lot of the general counsel are no longer called general counsel; they're called the chief compliance officer, because we're living in an era where compliance is the buzzword.
And we talked about your application, and you had you had to make a sort of pitch about what your dissertation would be, what you would focus on. As you did more research, did anything surprise you, or did it sort of flesh out along the lines that you foresaw or anticipated?
So a lot of things surprised me. Initially when I proposed it, it was more current. I was reading the Chronicle of Higher Education every morning, and noting that there were enough lawyers being appointed that in my mind, this was a trend. And I went to look to do some research, and there was nothing. There was one article in Forbes magazine. There was a mention in the New York Times that at one point there were 3 lawyer presidents, but like nobody ever followed up with it. There's never been a story in the Chronicle or Inside Higher Education, nothing in the ABA journal, although there is one now because of my research. I pitched a story to them, and a writer did something based upon this work. There was also no data available. And so I think the greatest contribution of this project is that in the appendices of the dissertation and the book will be the names and some data about all of the lawyer presidents that I was able to find. And I have to qualify that with that I was able to find, because there was no data set to compare it to. So the contribution is all of this original data that allowed me to do, with the empirical research, create these tables and charts and analyze the data, looking at who are these lawyer presidents. So in the report, I talk about, where did they go to law school? Did it matter where you went to law school? I looked at the decades that they were presidents, that lawyers were presidents, to see, was one decade better than the other? And quite frankly, for the last 3 decades, the number of lawyer presidents has more than doubled in each decade. So it's not just a one-time phenomenon. This is something that I've been tracking from a longitudinal perspective as well. I looked at what degrees lawyer presidents had. In addition to the JD, did they have any other graduate degrees? A bunch had PhDs, EDDs, a number had MBAs. There were also some lawyers who were doctors, and lawyers with MPHs. And so, that was just interesting to see. Then I looked at what states had the most lawyer presidents. And then I compared that. Was it significant? I looked at the states that had the most number of colleges and universities as well. So I tried to keep the data balanced in the analysis to see whether anything truly made a difference. I looked at public schools and private schools, community colleges, religiously affiliated schools. I was surprised there were a higher percentage of lawyers who were presidents of religiously affiliated schools. And again, that might be because of federal regulations and financial aid, and being able to be true to your religious values and tenets, and at the same time qualifying for federal programs and financial aid for your students. I looked at gender, male and female presidents. I looked at their backgrounds. I think the most startling discovery that I made, and you'll appreciate this because both of us share this background, the overwhelming majority of lawyer presidents in their past were a government lawyer. And so I write about that and the skill set and the mindset of government lawyers and what they might contribute to a campus. I looked at other things in their background, like were they a general counsel? Were they employed at a college or university as a fundraiser? And did they serve on a college or university board of trustees? Because that was another trend that nobody else had picked up on. But boards of trustees are the appointing authority for presidents. So some were appointing their own members of the board who happened to be lawyers because they thought they had a skill set. Some people who became lawyers, who became presidents at one school had been on a board of trustees at another school. And again, it's knowing the business of higher education, but coming from the outside. I also looked at a number of other demographics. I looked at lawyer presidents at HBCUs. And I think that, going from the civil rights movement and even to present, where we didn't have many Black lawyer presidents. And now that trend is turning around, not just at the HBCUs, but traditionally that's the only place you could find them. And now I think we're seeing more, thankfully, women and other underrepresented minorities in the C-suite. So that was nice to track as well. And then the chair of my dissertation committee is Paul Finkelman, who is not a lawyer, but he's been on the law faculty of probably half a dozen law schools. He's the former president of Gratz College, and he's now the chancellor there. He's a legal historian. And so he had me go back in the very beginning of the project to look at historically who were the presidents when the first colleges and universities were created in the United States. And he knew, but I discovered that they were either lawyers or ministers. And so I was able to sort of discuss that and tie in everything from the 1700s and bring it to present.
Yeah, I know that, and again, there's a lot of different pieces in what you just said. Was there, for example, in where did the president who is a lawyer go to school, for example, anything discernible there? Or was that, no, it's really the experience, not the credential that mattered? I'm just curious to see if you can tell us anything more that you sort of felt qualified as either a trend or a pattern in these different things that you looked at.
Well, interestingly, there was a correlation to like the top 10 law schools in U.S. News and World Report had the most number of lawyer presidents. However, there were a lot of lawyer presidents that went to unranked law schools, and second tier law schools as well. So, at first I thought, is this a position that is protected for the elite? And, and yet Yale and Harvard, had its fair share, in University of Pennsylvania and University of Chicago, but there were lots of other schools as well, and that's well documented. And actually, that was another place where I went to look to collect the empirical data. How does one go about finding the names of over 400 lawyer presidents? When I pitched my topic, I knew of about 30 or 40, and I thought I'd find, double that or triple that, but I didn't expect that I was going to find almost 500. And so, I really spent the time finding them and then researching each person. There was a lot of historical research and legal history in this as well, in order to figure out what those commonalities or differences were among the various lawyer presidents.
And it sounds, I think you went website to website.
So
as part of your research, there may have been other parts to it too, but you I mean, this was the internet version of shoe leather.
In some respects, so the research started with, your typical putting together your bibliography. And the bibliography, though, was a lot about leadership in higher education and the history of higher education. There's very little, as I said, written about lawyers in higher education. I think that there were like 3 public press articles, and then there were a few dissertations that talked about non-traditional leadership in higher education, and they had identified a couple of lawyers as part of the 5 or 6 people or 8 people in their studies, and so that provided some names. Then your typical, search engine searches with keywords, just like you're doing a Boolean search on Westlaw or Lexis, that yielded some names. Then when the pandemic hit, I was able to, with help from some research assistants, sit and go through the websites of the roughly 4,300 Carnegie schools and looked at the current president to see were they a lawyer or not. And then a lot of the schools, but not all, had a history of the office of the president and the bios of the former presidents. And we went through every single one of them, the names, to see if they had a JD, or in earlier times, if they were a lawyer, because some of them were presidents as lawyers before there was a JD degree, and in the early days. And so we captured all of those, and then I went to the Wikipedia pages of the top law schools in the country, because they have typically a section on notable alumni, and they had alumni who were in higher education in the president's office. Again, not every tier 1 law school had that, but a lot of them did. That captured names. Then I started talking to people about the dissertation and about the topic, and I would go to law school conferences and bring my spreadsheet with me that had the names in alphabetical order. And I would ask people at the ABA and at ALS, do you know of any lawyer presidents, and who am I missing? And so it was non-traditional research, but the only way to collect this data, and I'll say that the only other related data set that was available, the American Council on Education does a study of the college presidency every roughly 5 years. And they put out a report, and they have some demographic information. And in the last couple of reports, they noted the degrees that the presidents had. And so I could see the percentage of lawyers who were presidents, but their survey pool was only 1,600 schools. And it was the people who responded from that survey pool. And while they shared some of their aggregate data with me, they would not share the names of the presidents or the names of the schools that had lawyer presidents, because they didn't want to do anything that would appear to compromise the anonymity of their survey, because they promised they thought they had to keep that confidential. So again, there was nowhere to turn because nobody had a list. And so to me, that's the coolest contribution, that a list has been created. I have a website that is in beta, that when the book comes out, it will go live. And so all of the data will be there for the public. And honestly, I'm hoping that people who are interested will look to see if their name is there, or if the name of somebody that they know is there. And I only expect that the list is going to grow.
Yeah, no, this is, as someone who rarely, in fact, maybe even exclusively does sort of the traditional, type of whatever research and writing, what you've done is, I mean, truly incalculably invaluable in planting a tree, if to mix metaphors, so that there's this really way to think about, or at least try to understand in a comprehensive rather than anecdotal way, what this looks like, what this area looks like. So there's going to be a lot of people standing on your shoulders with what you've done.
I hope so. Another thing that I looked at that I didn't mention is I looked to see who was coming from inside academia and who was from outside academia. And the traditional view is that
Yes.
the people that are college and university, they sort of rose up through the ranks of the academy. So they got their PhD, they became a postdoc, they got a faculty position, maybe they became a department chair and then a dean, and then they went over to central administration, and all of this was the learning and the setup to be a president or of a college or university. So I looked to see, okay, where would these lawyers come from? And I tracked in part of the paper a little bit about the history of legal education as well. And when law schools first started and when the explosion of law schools happened in the 70s and 80s, and to think, there was a time when we had, 3 or 4 law schools, and then we had 40 or 50 law schools, and today we have over 200 law schools. That's a lot of faculty, and that's a lot of associate deans, and that's a lot of deans. And so, where's the career trajectory for people that maybe don't stay inside the law school? So I looked at how many of the lawyer presidents were law professors, were law deans, were provosts, or had other academic experience. And that other experience might have been, there were a fair number who were political science faculty and business school faculty. Even though they were lawyers, they were not actually teaching at a law school. And there were a lot of lawyer presidents who went from law professor to being president. They were not a law school dean, and then a fair number again of lawyers who came from outside the academy altogether, not even serving on a board of trustees and not serving in any other role, but people looking for the non-traditional candidate, with business savvy and community contacts, and they might have been a government lawyer in the past. The other, and which I do want to talk about with you because of our government lawyer experiences, but the other interesting theme in the paper there, that it's complex because there are many levels depending upon what you're interested in you could take away from this. There has been a trend in legal education to provide leadership training and leadership education for law students. And the paper notes a growing number of law schools that have leadership courses. And the American Association of Law Schools recently created a section on leadership in law. And so, again, all of this is building on, the creativity, who are leaders and what are the skill sets that we want our leaders to have. And, lawyers have traditionally been viewed as leaders, but we never had any formal training on that per se. But now it's becoming part of the curriculum in dozens of law schools.
Yeah, we'll get back to the government lawyer piece, I hope, but that's because I think we both graduated law school more or less around the same time. We're part of the same era, and absolutely there was no such course on leadership per se, like a classroom course on leadership. So let me ask first, since you've held a number of leadership positions, including Dean of the Law School and your current position at Touro University, how did you develop your leadership skills?
So, I think that a lot of it goes back to kinds of people that self-select to go to law school and be lawyers. I think a lot of us have been involved in the community. A lot of us have been involved in, going back, thinking about high school and college, in student organizations, in various leadership roles. I think a lot of it is on the job training. Part of what I think about in why is a lawyer prepared to be a college or university president, I start to think about all the different roles and responsibilities that a president has. So one, for example, is you have to be an effective communicator. Well, unless you're a transactional lawyer who gets to just sit in an office and fill out papers and you don't really have to communicate with people, lawyers have to be good communicators. We have to be good communicators because we have to attract and retain clients in a professional way. And a lot of it is reputation. You have to, if you're a litigator, you have to have some charisma and some ability to communicate with the jury, and with the judge. And so, part of framing issues, framing the message to the campus community. That's a lot of what lawyers do in the communication skills. When I think about the business side, I think about higher education is dependent on revenue, and revenue comes primarily from three sources. It comes from student tuition dollars. Well, that's not unlike a lawyer who is running a law firm. You don't eat if you don't have clients. You have to attract clients. You have to attract students. And then on the business side, well, you have to run your firm. You have to hire staff. You have to, have your supplies. You have to keep the schedule. I mean, a lot of things, again, it's simplistic, but a lot of things that a campus president has to do. A campus president has to fundraise. That's the third source of revenue. The second source. The third source is government. But in fundraising, again, lawyers both have to raise capital and bring in their clients in order to generate firm billables so that they can pay themselves and the people that work at the firm. And lawyers also are philanthropic by nature and are involved in lots of nonprofit boards because everybody wants a lawyer on their board for good reason. And so that creates sort of the ability, again, to figure out how to connect with community organizations, philanthropists in the community, because they bring that to the table. And on the government side, again, lawyers knowing how to advocate with state legislatures, county legislatures, the federal government for resources for their institution, capital funds, maintaining financial aid, support other existing government programs. And that's advocacy that lawyers typically learned in law school. And again, the idea that so many of these lawyer presidents were government lawyers, they know how the game works, and they know the mindset. And, when you take a course in college and state and local government, it is nothing like the experience of working in state and local government. There's how the book says, and then there's the reality of being in it.
Yeah, so your answer leads me to sort of rethink one of the questions that I was thinking about, because on the one hand, you've given this very detailed answer about your own experience, as well as, characteristics that substantially define most lawyers, or that define many, most lawyers. I wonder whether there's, at first I was going to say, there's a hole in our curriculum, because we should be teaching some kind of offering some kind of leadership class. But now I'm thinking, well, do we need to? That is to say, there's all these other influences, experiences, possibilities. What are your thoughts? I'm of both minds as I'm asking the question.
I think it depends what the leadership class is and what the skill sets are. Another thing that I think that some lawyers bring to the table, and that's important, is how to work in a team and how to collaborate. And, I think back to, this did not happen at Touro, but in a prior, course that I taught, I had the students work on projects together. It was a government ethics class, and I had students take a different public official who had been convicted on government ethics charges and related charges. And I had them build a Wikipedia page on each of the public officials, and sort of do the research together and look at the crimes and look at some of them. The year that I did this, the Supreme Court was deciding a couple of cases that really impacted whether a couple of people were going to be able to get out of jail. And so I had the students rate each other, because sometimes you find that you have law students that have type A personality and believe that they're the best and they know how to do it and they want to get it done. And then you have law students that are more quiet and thoughtful and, maybe not quick to jump, but just as good on the material, and maybe even better because they've taken time to reflect and think about it. And I wanted to see, I graded the team as a team, but then I wanted to grade the individual students. And so I had them all grade each other on a rubric. And it was amazing what I found out, in terms of students, in some cases, just believing that there was no team effort because somebody else took charge.
Yeah, I know that collaboration is certainly something. I think in the last couple of years, it certainly has more generally migrated into the law school curriculum. The idea that this is something we should be doing more with our students, because they're certainly going to have to do more of it.
And I think
when they graduate. Mm-hmm.
And lawyers are taught to be honest and to be transparent. Is every single one that way? No, but we hope they are, and we follow the rules of professional responsibility. And so in many respects, those are good leadership traits and qualities as well.
I wanted to let me sort of come back to two things. The first was there anything more about the government lawyer piece that we've left, we haven't discussed yet? I wanted to make sure that, as a former government lawyer, that was given full airing. Uh-huh.
Yeah, because, when you go in, depending upon what office you're in, many days you go in and your job is to react to what is in the news, right? And you don't know today what's going to be the next major issue before your office. You may have an agenda of things you'd like to address, but really you're reacting to what's going on around you. And you're researching the issue of the day, on the front page of the local newspaper or the national newspaper. And that's not unlike what a campus president has to do when there's unhappy faculty, unhappy staff, unhappy students, or something is happening outside that's impacting the campus. And so being able to be a quick study, being able to bring people together to figure out how to work through the challenge and what the messaging is going to be and how to give everybody confidence that they're being heard and that the issues are being addressed. They might not win, but it's the idea of problem solving.
Yes. And there's my shorthand for thinking about this, of course, is like if you will, the process piece. That is understanding that problem solving is a process, is something that can certainly, I think government lawyering is conducive to that, at least in my experience. There's one more thing I want to touch on, which you did mention, but I want to make sure in the same spirit that we gave it, a full discussion, because you have a chapter entitled Women Lawyers Emerging as Campus Presidents, and you noted earlier that was something that, a trend that you identified that is occurring, seems to be continuing to occur. And any thoughts about why that is true? Is that just part of the general, progress that's been made, in the workplace generally? Not saying that by any means that it's complete or done, but is it that story, or are there other pieces to it too?
Honestly, I think the story in large part, and again, I only looked at the lens of lawyers who were presidents, so it'd be women lawyer presidents. And, women were not part of law school classes in large numbers until the 1970s. And it was still small in the 1970s. Today, it's just about 50-50. Some years, it might be 51-49% women to men. But so I looked at sort of the emergence of women lawyers, women in the legal profession, and that kind of tracked also, with a little bit of a delay because they had to graduate and they had to get into their profession. But as the number of women lawyers grew, the number of women lawyer presidents grew. And so, I thought that was validation that women lawyers, at least in this field, it was proportional to the increase of women lawyers in the profession. I looked at other studies. There was the White House project, which was set in Colorado, about women in higher education and women leaders in higher education. There's been a lot written about that, that there have not been very many women presidents in higher education. I think in the last, 5 or 8 years, that has started to change. There's been a much greater increase in diversity all around in the leadership ranks in higher education.
All right. Well, let me ask, this is kind of the catch-all question. Is there anything we've left unexplored? Anything that, on a closing note, that we should, you want to discuss or bring our attention to?
So I think it's a great question. And I think the summary here is for law students and lawyers. One of the things that we always say is when you have a law degree, you can do anything, and that it's the legal education of thinking, right? We can always look it up, but it's the training of thinking like a lawyer and that problem solving skill set and how to analyze situations and problems from different perspectives and putting the framing on your argument and the emphasis on writing and communication and verbal communication. All of those things are part of legal education. And, when you come up through a different discipline, and now, by the way, I make it clear, I am not suggesting that we should have only lawyers as presidents, and I'm not suggesting that lawyers make the best campus presidents. We've had, a whole history of outstanding college and university presidents who come from all kinds of disciplines within the liberal arts and also the sciences. What I am saying is that in the past, lawyers were overlooked because the JD was not, considered a traditional terminal academic degree, that there were not a lot of law schools that, in the history, so there were not a lot of people in academia who were lawyers to fit that traditional pipeline that used to exist. And now we look and we see lawyers, they're leading the Fortune 100 companies. There are more lawyer CEOs of Fortune 100 companies. And I mention that as a parallel because higher education is similar in many ways to a Fortune 100 company. The larger the school, the larger the enterprise, the more things that the campus president has to be responsible for and aware of. So, we tell students and people interested in law school, you don't have to see yourself in a courtroom. You don't have to see yourself doing trusts and estates or doing real estate. We need lawyers to do that. And that's great. You don't have to be a prosecutor or a defender. You could run a business because, again, there's regulatory aspects to that. There's tax, there's labor law, there's business law, there's incorporation issues, there's your employment issues. And then you could also do something else. And that something else is in higher education. There's a lot of something else's, but again, just the big picture items. And I think the biggest takeaway from this is that in my dissertation, I predict at the end that by the end of this decade, 10% of college and university presidents, sitting college and university presidents, will be lawyers. That's astronomical. The ACE survey had about 4%. And so looking at how things have changed and watching the trends of the increase in each decade, And I'll just take, we're only in 2022, so we're 2 years into this decade, and we have 60 new appointments of lawyers as college and university presidents. That's not the majority of the new appointments by any stretch of the imagination, but it's significant in only 2 years to continue to see this trend growing.
Yeah, no, I know you've crunched the numbers. I wouldn't bet against you on the 10%. Thank you. I think we'll wrap here. We'll call it a night. But it's been a pleasure talking to you about your research and your work. And really, I'm saying it sincerely. I can't wait to get your book. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the Touro Law Review for hosting the podcast as well.